Hello and welcome to All Things Foster, a place for coffee, connection, and community. Guys, I am very honored to have Michelle on with us today, and we're going to get to her in just a second. But before we do, this episode of All Things Foster is brought to you by West Texas Wellness Center in Amarillo, where your health and well-being are their priority. Led by Dr. Zach Parker and his experienced team, West Texas Wellness Center offers natural, drug-free chiropractic care designed to help you live with less pain and more mobility. From neck, back, and joint pain to neuropathy support and customized wellness plans, Dr. Parker takes time to listen and create a care plan that fits your body and your life. Whether you're dealing with everyday aches, chronic pain, or just want to improve your body's natural balance, their whole person approach focuses on getting to the root of the issue, not just masking symptoms. Chiropractic care can even help improve digestion, increase energy, and enhance overall wellness by keeping your spine and nervous system aligned. Visit West Texas Wellness Center at Wolfland Square in Amarillo or call them at 806-352-1500. That's 806-352-1500 to learn how Dr. Parker and his team can help you move better, feel better, and live better naturally. And so I say this most every week. Dr. Parker is a big supporter of our organization, and Nikki and I have used him for various things over the years. And so if you're needing some help, check out Dr. Parker. He's a great guy and a great chiropractor. So welcome, Michelle Maikoetter, to our podcast. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on today.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to it ever since we met a couple of weeks ago. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I saw when they put that out that they were going to do that meeting, and I saw you, and I looked you up a little bit and looked at your credentials, and I was like, man, I need to hear that. And so, and it was really good. Kind of hard to condense everything down into like 20 minutes.
Yes, it is very much.
But it's always good. So, so today we're going to talk about the neurosequential model and just the brain, kind of how it works, how it develops. And so, Michelle, why don't you start? Just give us a little bit of your background, kind of what your experience is and stuff like that.
Okay. So I started out in wilderness programming. I have a bachelor's in psychology, and you can't do a whole lot with just a bachelor's when you first get out of school and don't have any experience. So I started out with long-term wilderness counseling, which we don't even do anymore. But that was my first entry into it. And then I got my master's and became a licensed professional counselor and a nationally certified counselor. And most of my work has been in residential settings, with my most recent being at Cal Farley's Boys Ranch outside of Amarillo for 18 years.
Wow.
But I also did juvenile probation. I did after-school programming with the Boys and Girls Club of America. I did domestic violence and sexual assault outreach programs. But residential has always kind of been my heart because you get to build a community to really try to help those kids. And so that's where I learned about Dr. Perry's model, was at Cal Farley's. And we went through formal training starting back in 2010. And then it took us 2 years to become a site that was certified in his model. And then he chose me as one of his first, he used to call us fellows. And back then it was called the Child Trauma Academy. It's now called the Neurosequential Network, and we're known as mentors. And then when he wrote his book with Oprah called What Happened to You, he got a little bit busier. And so now I do some work for him to do training with individuals and organizations that want to learn more about his model.
Yeah. That's so cool. I mean, we've talked about Dr. Perry on here quite a bit, and his work is just so. I went through a book study on What Happened to You about a year ago, and man, it is good. It's just good to try to understand. You know, he tells a story about a young lady, and I can't remember all the details, but she was in the hospital, and they couldn't figure out why she I think she had diabetes, and her insulin would spike periodically, and they couldn't figure out why. And then it turned out that every time an ambulance came, that that she would hear the sirens, and then that reflected back to some experiences that she'd had. They moved her to a different part of the hospital, and the problem went away. I mean,
Yeah.
man, just wow. So,
Yeah.
yes, that's got to be
Amazing.
really cool working for him.
Yes, it is. And, when I first heard about his work, when he was first coming out with it and formalizing it, I was working with at-risk populations, challenging situations, and it was the first time I felt like, wow, this really makes sense. And then once you learn it, you wish you would have known it, all these years ago. And you think about different kids that you've worked with, and just have a different appreciation for some of the challenges that you're seeing, not just with the kids, but within ourselves and with each other, and why sometimes things go off the rails and we don't really understand why.
So what was the driving force to get into psychology in the first place?
So it was really because I started out as a journalism major.
Okay.
And I really like to write. And I came from a really small school. I came from a small school in South Texas. And I didn't have much journalism experience. And so when I started writing for the school paper, my university's paper, and got edited, I didn't like being edited. And so as an 18, 19-year-old who thought no one should have to edit me, I was in a psychology class. And so that second year, I changed my major to psychology just because I liked the professor. But I've always kind of wanted to help people. And I'd been, worked in summer camps and, did those kind of things with younger kids. And so, and I had an interest in wilderness. I was doing a lot of hiking and mountain climbing at the time. And so with that bachelor's degree, that's how I got into wilderness programming, because at the time I didn't want to be in an office and I wanted to help adolescents. And so that's how I kind of got into that world.
That's funny. Like the professor. And then here you are, 20 years later.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool.
And actually using the degree, which most of my friends have a degree that they're not using it for anything related to it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. My wife and I are big Dave Ramsey folks, and I don't know if you know who he is, but he talks about these people going and getting a $100,000 degree in left-handed puppetry.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. So yeah, that's cool. So you have 30 years of experience working with kiddos from hard backgrounds, right?
Yes.
That's wow. I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but Mike Wilhelm was on the podcast a few weeks ago, and so it's the work that goes on out there at Boys Ranch is it's just really important.
It is. And Mike and his program was such a big piece of our implementation to become trauma informed and to create just a holistic integrated approach, which you don't typically see, or I have not typically seen that when I've seen other residential facilities. The spiritual development has kind of always been separated, has kind of always been independent of the rest of the programming. And Mike was such an important piece for us to be able to create a therapeutic community.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah.
So let's kind of start with what is the neurosequential model? What does that mean for folks out there that don't have a clue?
Yeah, so neurosequential is a word that Dr. Perry made up, and it's to emphasize the sequential development. The brain develops from the bottom to the top, from the inside out. And his model uses an upside-down triangle heuristic to break the brain into 4 parts or functioning areas, which is overly simplistic, and we realize that. But it's really to learn how the brain develops and then organizes based on our past experiences, especially our relational experiences, because we know the brain is a historical organ. It learns, it creates memory based on our experiences, but specifically relational ones, because that's where we thrive or we don't within our, relationships. And so it's looking at, based on those relationships and experiences, how the brain has organized and then how that might be impacting you now.
Sure. When I read, I may be jumping, but when I read what happened to you, if I remember correctly, the brain is receiving something like 6 or 10 million bits of data every second. And we can't process all that. So then it maps back toward everything that happened up until that point.
Right. So it's taking in all the external information, it's taking in all the internal information that it's getting, so sensory information, but then also, being tired, being hungry, you need to go to the bathroom, all those internal signals, and it filters all of that through past experiences because we don't have an infinite amount of memory, we don't have all the space, and so it's constantly trying to make shortcuts to make things match up to experience to say this is what we do with this or this is how we respond to this. And so it's filtering it through all those previous experiences to try to make sense, to try to predict what's going to happen in order to keep us safe, because we know the brain's constantly trying to keep us safe and figure things out and predicting what's going to happen next is what helps us stay alive. Yeah.
So when you talk about, the neurosequential model being bottom up and inside out, and everything maps back to something that happened in the past. So working from the bottom up, we talk about the kind of the basic systems. So you're talking like, okay, temperature regulation and, breath and all that kind of stuff develops. Those types of things are the beginning, and then we develop outward from that.
Right. Yeah. So those basic brainstem area, those functions for the brainstem area, those are almost completely developed in utero. So anything that happens in utero impacts that brainstem, which is your foundation for the rest of the brain to be organized. And so we know that anything that occurs in utero that might disorganize that. So it might be domestic violence, it might be drugs and alcohol, it might be homelessness and chaos, those kind of things can sometimes disorganize those functions. And that's your foundational base for later relational experiences, for controlling impulses, for thought processes, and those kind of things. And so we look at all of that, especially 0 to 3. So in utero to 3 years old is when the brain is most in development for all those different areas. And so we know anything that occurs during that time has a disproportionate impact on how it organizes and functions. And we used to think that it didn't matter what happened to you during that time because you didn't have a memory of it. But really, memory and language is in the cortex, which is that final area of the brain to develop that doesn't fully develop to mid-20s, early 30s. And that's just one area of our brain, but we tend to think of our brain as only being the cortex instead of understanding all these other functions that are going on that are meant to interact together in a coordinated way.
Yeah. And yeah, they used to think, well, if you adopt a baby, straight from the hospital, everything's going to be fine, and they're just a blank slate. And we found that there's so much that happens in utero that it just affects everything.
Yes. Yeah. Because we know that, memory and DNA is really memory carried forward, right? And so anything that happens in utero and then specifically attachment and bonding time. So there's sensitive developmental periods for attachment and bonding. That 0 to 2 weeks is a critical period. And if babies get removed during that time, they're often either in a NICU or they're waiting to be sent to a family. And so that's a critical sensitive developmental period. And then that 0 to 2 months is another sensitive developmental period for attachment and bonding. And so just like you were saying, it doesn't mean then that even if you adopt a baby at birth that there won't be any effects. Not saying there will all be negative effects, but there's still that groundwork has been laid down and it might be disorganized or disrupted based on the difficulties or the challenges during that in utero time. So it's really, it's a combination of a lot of things that are supposed to happen, right? So we can have issues with either there being some abuse where there's actual physical or sexual abuse that we wish didn't happen, but then there's also things that are supposed to happen. And so if we have a present, attentive, attuned, responsive caregiver who, when we cry or we have a demand, so we need to be changed or we need to be held or we need to be fed, that we have a caregiver who's able to consistently meet those needs, it's showing that our nervous system is getting stressed. And then because our caregiver responds in the way that they need to, then our stress, resolves and we get calm again. And you can think about how many times that happens for a baby if their needs are met when they're asking, for something that they need and it's met over and over again, and how that helps create this consistent stress response system that can be activated, but then can be soothed by an external caregiver. And then the opposite would also occur. So if a need is expressed and a baby's need isn't able to be met by the caregiver. So maybe the caregiver's depressed, maybe the child's been left to an older sibling to take care of, maybe nobody comes at all, then that stress response stays activated, does not get soothed by the caregiver, and then it becomes what we call sensitized, so sensitive to stress in the future. And so you'll hear a lot of times, that sometimes we'll hear they were such a easy baby because they never cried. And what we know is a lot of times it's because the child expressed a need and it wasn't met, and the only they could do at that in that young of an age is to dissociate, which means physically present, but emotionally you're not really there.
Right.
You're not really present. And so that's our only really mechanism or defense mechanism when we're that young. And so the need quits being expressed because there was never an answer to the need. And so, again, that stress response system comes into play with everything that we do. It's meant to be balanced, it's meant to be reactive in an organized way, in a proportional way. But then once it gets sensitized, and that's not just that young age, it can be sensitized for a lot of reasons, but then it becomes reactive and overly responsive. So, any of us that have experienced unpredictable, uncontrollable, severe amounts of stress become sensitized in our stress response system. And most people recognize this, especially if you've experienced grief or something traumatic, how you become emotionally reactive, more on edge, more explosive, maybe. And it's because of that sensitized stress response system.
Yeah, I remember in Karen Purvis's book, she talks about going to China and walking into these orphanages, and there's 30 or 40 cribs, and it is deathly quiet because the babies learn if I cry, nobody comes, so I just stop crying.
Yeah. And then even, the research that shows the ones that because of overcrowding, they had to put a couple of babies in cribs together, that those babies actually did better because they had some social interaction just with the other babies. Yeah.
So a lot of times with kiddos, if we see these them acting out in certain ways, it's there's a pretty decent chance, right, that they're reacting to something that has pulled them back to something previously in their past, right?
It could be that. It could be. I mean, I think it's kind of interesting how we have a very I don't know, kind of this view that children are doing everything intentionally. Right, like everything is willful, everything is thought out and premeditated. Whereas, if the cortex is responsible for impulse control, is responsible for future-oriented thinking, and isn't fully developed to the mid-20s, early 30s, then, kiddos do not have such a complex capacity for those kind of things. And so, like, we recognize that in ourselves when we make mistakes. We know, we were tired or we were stressed or we were overwhelmed, and that's why we didn't perform the way we wanted to, or that's at work or within our relationships. But then when kids make mistakes, we have this unrealistic expectation that that they should be able to perform like adults do. And then two, that it was intentional and that they need to be punished for it, instead of understanding that, all of us want to do the best that we can. And when we can't, there's something going on that's preventing us from being able to do it. And it's our jobs as parents, as supervisors, to see what do we need to do to help you be able to perform as well as you can. Instead of going straight to, you need to be punished because you were doing this on purpose, instead of looking at it as they were tired, they were overwhelmed, even if we don't understand, right? And so I think that's a piece of it, is what you're talking about, is if we've had these really difficult early experiences, with caregivers not meeting our needs consistently, and then we have a sensitive stress response, we can see these big reactions to things that we think shouldn't have been that big a deal. And so often it has to do with novelty. Something changes, a transition out of one activity to another. Novelty is a stress for us. Change something, it has a little bit of threat response for us. And so for children that are already, or anyone who's already sensitive to any kind of change like that, it can really push them over the edge. And so when we say, I know I said we were going to go Chick-fil-A, but we ran out of time, we're not going now, and then a kid has a meltdown, we kind of feel like, oh, it's just because they didn't get what they want. Instead of understanding it, their stress response, their stress system is already overwhelmed, and we've kind of pushed them over the edge of what they can handle.
Yeah. All right. So understanding why kids do what they are doing can help us respond with compassion and empathy to to recognize, like you said, they're not making this logical, rational decision to go and do this or that. They're responding to what's going on around them
Yeah. And for
and
any one
reflecting
of us,
back.
yeah, and for any one of us, when we're in a stressful situation, if you think about a time when maybe you've behaved badly, and then later on, when your cortex came back online, you kind of say, I can't believe I did that, or I can't believe I said that, right? And so what we know is when we talk about the brain developing from the bottom to the top, that when we get stressed, it shuts down from the top to the bottom. Kind of our most thoughtful, our most sophisticated area shuts down first, because in order to survive, the brain needs to react in a physical way. That's its first go-to, is to react first, think later. And so we're always wanting you to think first, but that's really against our biology a little bit to keep us alive. And so, understanding that when we see these kind of behaviors, even in ourselves, a lot of times it's because that cortex is shut down, and it is a more emotional response or a more reflexive response than what we're looking for. And so that makes sense, right? When you think about a time you've done something that was, maybe over the top, maybe you yelled, or maybe you used language you wish you wouldn't have. And then later on you think, I can't believe I did that. It's because the cortex is back and it's helping you reflect on it. But in the moment, those lower areas of the brain are more activated, and they're the ones that are running the show at that moment, and that cortex is shut down.
So with kind of have a basic understanding, we talked about there's the four layers of the triangle, right? So we talked about the brainstem. Let's talk about the other three and kind of time frames, just so people can understand maybe where these kids are approximately at.
Yeah. So I think, so again, that upside down triangle is Dr. Perry's heuristic for a model of the brain, which is overly simplified, obviously, because the brain is extremely complex. And I'm sure you've seen the images that have a bajillion different things labeled on it. But that upside down triangle is just a representation of how the brain, the areas of the brain develop. And so the brainstem is the first area to develop that we already talked about. That next area to develop is diencephalon, and then the limbic system, and then the cortex. And so all those areas are in the greatest time of development from that 0 to 3. So again, not that there isn't any cortex available, it's just it's not very developed when you're born, because you could try to reason with a baby if you wanted to about why they shouldn't be crying. It's not going to get you anywhere. Although we do that still. We do that with 2 and 3-year-olds. We want to reason with them and be logical, right? And so just knowing that anything that occurs during that time can impact the way those areas of the brain develop. So they're meant to act more like an orchestra, so that there's a director, the cortex, if you want to call it that, who is saying, these instruments come out now, these recede now, we hear these more now, these go back. And it's meant to be in a very balanced and integrated way, so that you can have a proportional response. So if I'm in a conversation and I get upset, that I can be regulated enough, meaning that I have enough control of my energy and my attention to respond in a thoughtful way instead of a reactive way. But if I'm sensitized or sensitive, then I might have a disproportionate response. So rather than my cortex being to kind of tamp things down and say, it's okay, you don't need to get upset about this cortex starts to shut down. I have a more emotional response. If I keep getting pressed, I'll have a more reactive, reflexive response, because I'll have dropped to those lower areas of my brain being more activated and running the show.
Yeah. So what about as things, I know you said the most growth comes 0 to 3, then how about kind of age-wise, roughly, do things become more? I know you said the top of the brain, 20s, the early 30s. What about those two in between pieces?
Yeah. So if you were to guess, when do you think the limbic system, so the emotional attachment relational system, when do you think that's the most active?
Most active? I don't know. I mean, you would think probably, right,
yeah.
Adolescence, yeah.
Yeah. And so when we think back, like if you think back to your adolescence, You probably think about some of the things that you did and you can't believe you did them, right? That you wouldn't do now that you have a fully developed cortex, right? And so in adolescence, that limbic system is in most active development. And so it's not that they don't have a cortex, right? We know that adolescents can think and be thoughtful and very creative and those kind of things. But the limbic system is so active in development during that time that what's most important to us is fitting in with our peer group, right? Those relational connections. And so what we see is that they might determine, if I do this, I'm probably going to break my arm, but it'd be really cool and everybody will love me for it. It's worth it, right? So that overrides. Whereas, yeah, where later on when you get older and you go, that's crazy, and I'm not going to do that, right? So it's also why, like, when you hear music that was important to you from that age, it has a disproportionate, powerful emotional effect for you, right? Yeah, and it's because that system was the most activated, or most in development during that time. Yeah. So I do think a lot of it is psychoeducation about the difference between something being willful defiance, something being dysregulation, which we're going to say dysregulation about 100 times, but that inability to control your energy and your attention the way that you want to. And so what we see, especially that 0 to 2 and those foundational pathways are being laid down, is if you have that sensitive stress response, then small things will push you over the edge. And so, it could be being tired, it could be food textures, it could be the change in scheduling, it could be getting bumped by somebody, it could, someone new showing up to the house or the classroom or whatever. And so I think psychoeducation is a big piece just to allow for some compassion, some grace, some understanding, because this applies to all of us, not just the kids. Because what needs to happen is everything that we want to have happened at birth, right? So when you think about consistently meeting someone's needs, and Dr. Purvis talks about this a lot, about how many times did a caregiver meet that child's needs, right? To create this attachment, to create this predictability and consistency. Then when you haven't had that, we need just as many repetitions of those needs being met in a consistent way, in a nurturing way, the way you would with a baby, instead of in a punishing way or a shaming way. So needing those same kind of needs being met, but often, what's required for someone to learn how to self-regulate, so to self-calm or self-soothe, is that first we have to have a caregiver soothe us, like when we do when we're a child, and then we can go through what's called co-regulation, where
Right.
you can help me soothe myself by, it's okay, take some deep breaths, let's sit down, let's go for a walk, and to the point that then I develop the ability to regulate myself. But you can't skip those developmental periods. You can't go from not being able to. So when we say you need to go to your room and calm down, if I don't have the developmental sequence in place, I'm going to go to my room and I'm going to tear it up. And then we're confused, right? Because we were supposed to go calm down, and it made it worse because we're not understanding. We are not understanding. We're not understanding that sequence, and that you can't skip.
So yeah, you're talking. I mean, you're talking thousands. Just in the first
Repetition.
couple of years, you're talking thousands, tens of thousands of times
Yes.
when I have a need and the need is met, and I have the need. And so, if you've got an 8-year-old that didn't have that, then you're going to try to recreate that
Yes.
thousands of times, where you're helping them to regulate and come, get that brain back online and being able to think and things like that.
Yeah.
So
And so I think that's exactly right. It's like we want it to go faster, right? The developmentally, what's respectful. And so exactly what you're saying, that need has to be met over and over and over and over again, because you're trying to create that nice balanced stress response system instead of that continuing to create a sensitized stress response system. And so if we have the right amount of stress, I mean, we know this about exercise or physical activity, is like, if we have the right amount of stress, so if you have moderate, predictable, controllable amount of stress, you're going to build resilience. If I want to run a marathon and I follow a nice little plan that builds me up to the point I can run a marathon, if I go out tomorrow and I try to run 20 miles, I'm going to be hurt and not get very far and all these kind of things, because it was too much. It was, uncontrollable, severe, unpredictable, instead of a nice plan. And this is the same thing that we need to build, strengthen these different networks, is that we need to have this consistent, predictable response to our needs. And it takes so many repetitions of that, because again, that brain was most active development, that 0 to 3. And so it's going to take more repetitions now to help rebuild some of those things. And one of Dr. Perry's, quotes is about, when you go through therapy or you have anything therapeutic, you're not wiping out those old pathways, you're building new pathways. And it's like, a dirt road. You start out with a dirt road, you keep going through that road, you build some ruts. Eventually, you might lay down some cement until it dries, but that other pathway is still there. So if we have the right given circumstances, enough stress, enough overwhelm, enough things that are connected to our past, we can go back to those really kind of regressive behaviors or things that we did previously. It doesn't mean they just go away. It's still there, but we're trying to build these other pathways through getting needs met. And so really, I didn't answer your question. So really, for caregivers to be regulated themselves first, so to understand, I think that is a huge shift when you go into a setting. And I know even in residential, I would be called in crisis situations. When you go into a setting and your approach is to be regulated first, instead of trying to stop something or control something, which is usually how we go into behaviors or when kids are giving us challenges, but to go in where I have to be regulated and then regulate the child so that we can be relational, so that then we can talk about and reflect on. So that's one of the things that we were talking about earlier, is if I want you to learn from an experience, you have to be in your cortex. You have to be reflective. When you are in those lower areas that are activated, you're not going to be able to learn. And so being lecturing you or threatening you is not going to have the result that I want.
So, we have to be constantly willing to learn, and because even 10 or 15 years ago, we know so much more today than we did. We were watching through Special Victims Unit, the old Law and Order show, and Dr. Wong on there at one point, he's talking about the DSM-4 and how basically when by this point in time, you're done. Like there's no fixing, there's no learning, there's no going and overcoming. It's like your personality's fixed and there's nothing to do about it. And so as parents, we need to be always trying to learn how to interact and I mean, even think about it from our perspective. I've done a lot of reading and a lot of podcasting and this and that, and trying to learn, and I can't learn it I can't go to a seminar one time, listen to it, and go home and apply it perfectly from then on, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to be willing to constantly go back to the material and learn a little bit more, maybe stay regulated a little bit longer, have a little bit more compassion, and so being willing to learn. And then I don't know that always, probably the biggest thing is keeping that co-regulation piece in mind, saying I need to offer this child my regulation and
my calm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
what if you can't? What if you're
Yep.
activated too high and you can't?
Yeah. And so, we talk a lot about there's times when you're not going to be able to offer your calm, right? And so if you have someone, a partner, someone else who's helping you that you can tag out with, I mean, that's ideal, right? If in that moment you need to separate yourself so that you don't hurt someone or you don't do something, then you need to separate yourself. I know we all have this rule. It's got to be handled right in this moment. It handled the wrong way in that moment is not going to get us the results that we want either. So tagging out, making sure that if you have a partner, someone that's helping you with raising your kids, that y'all know, either what's going to make me upset, or what I look like when I'm upset. If I can't notice it, then we have several little code words, but like, why don't you go to your room and I'll take care of this? Or I think what you're trying to say is this, and we have a little partnership there. If you have that nice luxury, if not, there's times when you need to step back and make sure that's the first thing you do, because again, going in and just like you're saying, being open, when we're stressed, we can't be curious, right? And so sometimes that's what's so hard about parenting is that when you need the help the most is when you're least able to take it in, just like the kids, right? And so because I can't be curious about things unless that cortex is open. And so if I'm stressed and I'm more shut down, I'm going to be more emotionally reactive. And you trying to educate me is only going to irritate me, right? Because I don't have time for that. And just like what you're saying, and it takes so much, you can't, and that's what's so hard about this is because everybody wants these three things or these five things, right? And you want it to be like, I went to a seminar and I should be able to do this now. And the truth is, and kind of what you've alluded to, is so much of it is about our work and what we have to do to be able to be regulated. And I know self-care has gotten thrown around a lot, and I hate to talk about self-care, but what I hear often from caregivers is I don't have time to take care of me. But it's impossible to take care of someone else in a healthy way if you're not healthy, right? And so knowing that important piece of helping whoever you love, whoever you're trying to help, is that you have to be healthy. And so it's not just when you're upset. That's not what we think too, is like when you're upset, go do this. It's all those other things. And one of the things we've kind of touched on, but really is relational supports. Is that relationships are meant to buffer our stress for us. We're meant to help carry that load through other people. And when you don't have the relational supports in place, you can't hold that stress all by yourself. You can't do everything by yourself. And then we've kind of been told this myth that you should be able to. No one can.
Right.
And then we lose our relationship when we're really stressed. It's hard for us to reach out. It's hard for us to ask for help. But really, those relationships are meant to help us carry that load. That's what helps us be more regulated. Is if we have those relational connections and are intentional about making sure we keep them.
Yeah, and that's a big part of the reason why foster parents struggle so much is there's alienation from your community. A lot of times, I mean, I hear this so often that nobody at church understands, nobody here understands, nobody gets it, and so there's this alienation, and then you don't have that relational buffer to lean back on to try to move forward.
Yeah, and then you have plenty of people who don't understand some of the struggles, telling you what you should be doing. Right. And so that's the other piece is then that's even more alienating. It's like, and I hate that too, especially with churches, because I feel like churches really encourage foster and adoption, but then the struggles that come along with that is not often supported or acknowledged. And so then I do think, you feel very isolated, and you can't carry the weight of this on your own. In a healthy way. It's just too much. And we're meant to be in community with one another, to support one another, but we've kind of lost sight of that the relational connections is what makes the difference.
Right.
Um, in the same way with when we have punishments or we have consequences for kids, we do a lot of things that sends them away from us. You have to go do this task without understanding that that's fine if the child needs to make something right. They've broke something or they need to fix something or they need to repay something. But the idea is that it needs to be in a relational context for us to learn. Again, to borrow that calm from that regulated adult who cares about me, who I care about, not someone who I'm scared of and don't, right? That's not the right thing. But it's like, and so I used to be really concerned about the consequence, but now I'm really more about as long as it's in a relationship, the consequence can be whatever, as long as it's not harmful. But I mean, as long as it's in a caring relationship, that's how you're going to learn. It's not by you going off and doing something by yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, it just it's so much of everything it just boils down to relationship. The relationship is so important early on to develop, but then you don't have it, and so you fix it with relationship.
Yeah. So if you think about some of the things that we do, and I did some of these things before I knew better, but we'll threaten to break the relationship, right? If you don't stop doing that, we're going to leave you here. Right? It breaks my heart when I hear people say that. But that's what we withdraw the relationship as a punishment. And so when you understand how much stress that puts on us to be out of relationship is one of the most stressful things we can experience. And to understand that any challenge, well, my kids are grown now, they're 20 and 23, but the challenge is always to maintain the relationship, make it better, or at least maintain it. And so, again, approaching those things with being regulated yourself so you can help them regulate and that you want to maintain the relationship is a different approach than what most of us are used to. But it's exactly what you're talking about. If my kids can't come to me when they need help, then what was I doing? What am I doing as a parent? Because you want them to be able to come to you. And kind of the way we set things up is to make sure they don't come to us when they need
Yeah, that's just mm, you. Yeah, you're right. I mean, when we think about, because we so much of what we do, we just repeating, what was done, and if you stop and think about, the generational things, I mean, getting your butt whipped, and it's just getting yelled at or whatever. These are, we tend to parent the way that we were parented, and and if you just think about how things went with the World War II, the silent generation, the boomers, and all the things, and so we have to break out of just doing things the way that it was done for us.
Right. And it goes back to what we were talking about. You have to be regulated enough to be that reflective, right? And to look at, I can remember my husband and I disagreeing when my daughter was 3 about a consequence. She was misbehaving in church. And so the consequence was going to be that we weren't going to go eat breakfast with her grandparents afterwards. And I remember talking like, what are we doing? Like, why would we do that? Like, we're just punishing ourselves, And so anyway, but exactly, if you don't kind of reflect on, did that really do what I wanted, what I want it to do? Is that really the way it should be done? If we just do things reflexively like that, we're going to love the way that we've been loved. We're going to parent the way that we've been parented, unless we do something intentionally different. And you have to be in a space to be able to learn that, to do something different. Because I think any one of us, if you think about people in your life who have helped you learn and grow, you're not going to say it was the teacher that beat my butt and was mean to me, right? It's going to be this teacher you had a relationship with, boss that cared about you. I mean, and so it's so interesting to me because when we do those exercises, those are the people that will come out, the special people in our lives that took care to get to know us, to put some investment in us, to help support us. It's not the people that were mean to us, that punished us, that made us feel worse about ourselves. But that's what we keep trying to do to kids to make them perform better.
Yeah, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. Let's talk about a couple of strategies for like if a kiddo's having just a fallout tantrum, like what how do you approach that kind of a scenario?
So, ideally, just like what Dr. Purvis would say is if you catch it, the sooner you catch it, the easier it's going to be, right? So once you get into a full blown meltdown, really the only thing you have on your side is time. Right? And so once it's gone off the rails, I have to be regulated. And sometimes all I can do is go in and just take deep breaths. And I'm probably maybe I know with my kid, I could not get too close to them when they were that way. I had to stay away from them. I would just take deep breaths and try to not to make it worse. Right. And so again, being that non-anxious presence, that calm presence, they're not going to be able to process words. So I'm not going to use a lot of words. I'm going to be aware of this size differential because I don't want to be more threatening. And so side by side, we talk a lot about parallel activities are less threatening to us. So sitting beside you instead of in front of you, taking deep breaths, and then waiting. Like that's what we feel so much pressure to get things contained as soon as possible. And it really, usually has the opposite effect. And so if I'm able to go in, maintain my calm, not try to talk to you and consequence you and all those kind of things, but maintain my calm, hopefully you'll catch my calm. And so, but we have to have that presence of mind when we go in, because if we go in guns a-blazing, like if you quit doing this, you're not going to get together movies tomorrow, whatever kind of, we want to throw out there, they're not in the part of the brain that is thinking about consequences or time. And so we're not speaking to the same language at that moment. And so, and that sounds, simple, but it's not easy. Right. So, but to catch it sooner makes it
Yeah.
easier to not get to that point. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So like say, really, it just keeps coming back to being, physically there and offering calm. That's the biggest strategy, right?
Right. And safety, right? Like it to not be more of a threat, to not add more stress, right? And so if you're looking at it as someone's overwhelmed. So, I mean, if you think about a time when you've been overwhelmed, if I came up to you and started saying, Matt, if you don't get over this, this is what's going to happen. Is that helping that overwhelm at all?
Right.
No, right? It's just
Yeah.
causing you to be, or if I tell you to calm down, right? That's my favorite.
That's the
And I
wrong.
do it
Yeah.
too. I still do it. I'm not saying I do it, but if you've ever had someone tell you to calm down when you're upset, how little that helps you and how
Right.
it elevates you, right? And so
Yeah.
one of the terms I talk about is like, a dog barking at a cat to get out of the tree. It's like me continuing to stress you is not going to bring the stress down, is not going to help you calm. So having that shift in our minds about what are we trying to do here is really important.
Yeah. I just love this. This is so valuable. So let's talk for a second. I didn't put this in here, but let's talk for a second about the safety aspect, right? We're constantly trying to figure out, am I safe? Am I safe? And I don't remember the number that Dr. Perry talked about and what happened to you, but you are many, many, many times a second trying to figure out, am I safe?
Yes. So, what helps us survive is to be a part of the group, right? To belong, because we're very vulnerable on our own. And so anytime we enter a room or a situation or a person enters our space, the brain's constantly trying to sort at an unconscious level, not at a thought level. Am I safe? Am I accepted? Right? Am I in the group or am I out? Because if I'm out of the group, I'm not safe. Right. And so we're constantly, the brain, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's trying to predict. It's constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next so it can know how to respond. It's part of our survival mechanisms, again, beyond our level of consciousness most of the time. But that is consistently, it's like the spy software on your computer. It's constantly running without your awareness. And so knowing that I have an expectation for how things are going to go, right? So we're constantly trying to what's going to expect, what's going to happen. And when it doesn't go the way I expected, there's going to be a bit of a threat response or a stress response. Now, what's so hard is if my background tells me that adults are not trustworthy or adults are abusive, is that I expect you to respond that same way. So when you don't yell at me when I do something wrong, guess what? It's a little bit of a stress response because it didn't go the way I thought it was going to go. I know how to survive when you yell at me, but I don't know how to survive when you don't.
Mm.
So then what happens? You know what happens.
Yeah.
I'm going to attempt something, not at a conscious level, right? Yes, I'm trying to get to the familiar, which is not the same for everybody. So my familiar feels safe. Your familiar feels safe. And those can be two entirely different things. And so if I push and I push and I push and you finally yell at me, okay, we know what's going on here. We know how to survive this, right? And
Wow.
it's
Yeah. I've
totally
not thought about that.
opposite. Yeah, it's totally opposite of what we think should happen,
Yeah.
right? But it's if you for yourself, if you think about it in the opposite way, if you're used to people responding to you in a positive way, in a healthy way, and you walk into a room and no one greets you, nobody smiles at you, what's going to happen? You're going to be like,
What's going
what
on?
is, yeah, what is going on, right? And so we understand it when it's that, but it's the same if I expect people to treat me a certain way, even if it has not been a positive way, a healthy way, and you treat me differently, it makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. I had not looked at it that way. That's such a, and it's so contradictory to what we would assume that, you know, you would think, and I've talked about this many times on the podcast, but our normal, or what we assume is normal, is not this child's normal. And so so that automatically kind of gets you looking like, what's going on? You get that
Yes.
stress level up just a little bit, even though, you know, even though it is safe, everything's calm, everything's good to go. Kiddo's over here like something's off. Right.
Yep.
Wow. Mm.
Yep. Even if you're doing everything right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's the thing is like, that's what's so confusing is people will say, I said I loved you. I said it's okay. I said all this. And then I have this big reaction. Right. Because you're not understanding that's not about you because it feels really personal. So we talk a lot about relationship and then all of that feels very personal. But, and I think Dr. Purvis says, about how we're not battling the child, we're battling the child's history together. Right. And so the history is coming into play in those moments. But it's hard for us to take perspective how what's safe to me may not be safe to you. My safe should be your safe. Right. And so, and I'm sure you've seen like things that we think are celebratory. So birthdays, Christmas, right? All these things that we'll put all this work into it and the kids will have meltdowns and we'll feel like they should have appreciated that effort. They should have, all those kind of things, but it was so unfamiliar to them. It pushed them over the edge. It was too stressful. And so I've had kids who've never ordered off a menu in a restaurant before. And so you take them into a restaurant where they have to read the menu. They have to tell someone their order. They'll have a big behavioral incident in the restaurant to get out of the restaurant because it's too much stress. And so then again, we label it as, willful defiance. They're not appreciative, all these kind of things without understanding what that's about.
Hmm. Man.
And it really goes back to like having grace for one another, right? And
Yeah.
having that default of like everybody's doing as well as they can do.
Yeah.
Situation that they're in. And so when you see someone behaving badly, and I do this even if I see something bad on the news or I'm like, I wonder what is going on with that person that pushed them to that point,
Yeah.
instead of, gosh, what a jerk. Now, I'm not saying I don't sometimes still do that, but even when somebody passes me driving, I'm like, oh, I wonder what's going on with them today that this is such an irritant to them that they are, can't handle it. Yeah.
Yeah. Just trying to keep in mind. Okay, let's do this. So how are ways that because when kiddo gets up in arms and how do we stay, what are things that we can do to try to stay regulated? I know you said tagging out, but if I'm trying to stay in the moment and stay regulated to offer that, what can we do when we're not in that scenario to be able to stay in that moment and stay regulated longer.
Yeah. I think sometimes what helps me is I say, what's happening? Instead of why is this happening? Because when I say, why is this happening? I'm going to go to, because I'm not a good parent, right? Because I didn't do something right. Or
Yeah.
because this kid's, he's doing it on purpose, drive me crazy. But
Yeah.
what's happening here? What's happening here is we're overwhelmed, right? That's a totally different perspective to take. And then to know, like, whatever. And I know, again, this sounds so simple, but deep breaths, like physiologically, we calm our system if we take some deep breaths. So even if I can't do anything else, I can take deep breaths before I do anything. And then to have, if that thought process is available to us, what's happening? We're overwhelmed, we're stressed, we're dysregulated. What do we need to do? Take some deep breaths. Rock, anything rhythmic. So if you think about, again, a baby and how we soothe babies. So that rhythmic, repetitive, patterned kind of activity, we sing to them, we rock them, we swaddle them, we hold them, all these kind of things that are rhythmic, repetitive, and patterned. That's what helps us soothe the brain from the bottom to the top. Is that low brain, or that lower brain activation that helps calm you down. So if you think about times you've been really upset and you've had to go for a walk, or you've had to do something, it was probably rhythmic, repetitive. Maybe you listen to music to help soothe you. You can't always. So we talk a lot about top down, which would be the self-talk, which would be me saying, okay, I need to calm down. I need to take some deep breaths. This isn't that big of a deal. We can't always access that. And so when we are so dysregulated that words and calming isn't helping, we've got to do these bottom up activities. And so instead of me trying to talk to you in some kind of logical way, we're just going to go for a walk, or we're just going to sit here and breathe together, or we're just going to sit side by side and rock. Like, I love rocking chairs and those kind of things, but anything rhythmic, repetitive, and patterned is going to help that lower brain get soothed, so that then we can be more relational. So then we can be more cognitive, or we can be more, thoughtful about what we're doing.
Yeah. That's good. I like the idea of, just like stopping for a minute and saying, hey, okay, let's go for a walk.
Yeah.
We don't have to talk. We don't have to do anything. Let's just go for a walk. Or sit here and breathe, or whatever it is. Just not have to, I don't have to deal with this specific behavior or situation right now. What I've got to do is lower the energy and bring in that regulation, however we can do it, so that maybe in 5 minutes or 10 minutes we can talk about a consequence or whatever, but in the moment let's do something to bring it down, so that that upper part of the brain can engage and say, hey, okay, this is what happened, and this is what we're going to do about it, and stuff like that. But
Yeah, absolutely.
even just going for a walk, saying, hey, let's go for a walk. We're not going to talk. We're just going to go for a
Right.
walk,
Right. And that takes some thought and some intention, right? To say, okay, I don't have to fix this right now in this moment. I need to be regulated. They need to be regulated. We need to catch our breaths so that they can learn, instead of feeling like I got to do something right now that they're not. If you just think about for yourself, even just coming into a training, like when you came to hear me talk, if you were so stressed that morning, you had all this stuff going on in your personal life and your professional life, that you came in and you were pretty activated, you aren't going to be able to listen to you aren't going to be able to listen to what I'm saying, to take in what I'm saying, to learn anything from what I'm saying, because you've got too much other stuff that is taking priority, right? And so the kids are the same way. They can't learn in that moment when they're so stressed, they're so dysregulated, they're so concerned about their safety or their whatever's going on. And so it's like we understand that with ourselves, that when we go into a meeting and somebody wants to talk about something, so I had to be evacuated last week. I lived out in the area that was evacuated from wildfires, and we were out for 48 hours. And so I was looking at my Facebook, because that's where you get, most of your information. There was a fire about 2 miles behind our house. And so on my Facebook was all my normal stuff. So recipes and exercise things and arts and this kind of stuff. And I was so irritated that that stuff was on there because I don't need any of that, right? That's right. But that's how we all get is like, if I am calm and relaxed and I can flip through my Facebook and find those things entertaining or, you know, those, but in that moment when I'm worried about my survival, none of that matters. And that's how we are too. So in the moment, you trying to talk to me or teach me something that is irrelevant to me, is not going to have the impact that you, it's inefficient. It's not going to have the impact that you want. And so the simple, and again, sounds simple, but isn't easy to say, let's just go for a walk. And sometimes, just like I was saying, when I've been in crisis situations, I've just gone in and sat down and breathed because words weren't going to do it. I've had kids that were super upset that people have been trying to deal with them for hours. They call me as a last resort because they don't know what else to do. And then I go in and I sit down, you know, far away from them, but side by side, and I take some deep breaths. And I remember this one boy was like, I'd been there for about 10 minutes, and he goes, "Can I go to bed?" They've been up for hours yelling and fighting with this kid. And I was like, absolutely. But just not continuing to escalate and stress and overwhelm. So to be regulated. And then that next morning is same way when we've had kids who'd have, you know, run away. As soon as you find them is not the time to like, let's have this out. You're hungry, you're tired, you know, you're dirty, you're all these different things. Let's get all those needs met. And then we can come back and talk about what happened. How did we get here? What can we do different next time?
Man, if we could just do this, you know, if you could just get this in your mind and just do this consistently, man, it would so benefit ourselves and the kiddos that are in our care. Just keep trying to stay in that a little bit longer and offer that regulation, and then, you know, then deal with that. And you know, it's really kind of counter normal, and that's not
Yep.
the right word, but that's
I mean, it
opposite of
is.
what we would what our normal response is.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, if you think about just like at work, if someone wanted to teach you something in the middle of a crisis, would that be the time to teach you? You know, I mean, no, right? Like we know, and I think Dan Siegel's the one that says you don't build a shed in the middle of a storm. Right? It's like that doesn't make sense either. Again, we have these different expectations for kids. And then I think to know, because one of the things I talk about with parents too is that it doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. We're not asking you to be perfect. But we are asking you to be human, right? So when we make those mistakes and when we do yell or we, you know, we do the things that we wish that we didn't do, is that then I make repair, right? Because the strength is in the reparation. And so I can make mistakes as long as I go back and make the repair. The harm is when I make the mistakes and I don't repair or I act like it didn't happen. And the thing is when you make those mistakes and you don't acknowledge it, everybody knows it happened.
Yeah.
You know, we think if we don't acknowledge it, you won't know, but everybody knows. Right. And so even in the work that we did, it was not asking staff to be perfect because the kids aren't going to be in a world that's perfect, but asking them to be human, and that when we respond differently because we're stressed, because we're overwhelmed, that we make repair. And because we want the kid, like, what do you want them to learn? You want them to learn how to make relational repair. Right? And so if we don't ever model that, if we don't teach them that, if they don't see that, they only hear us telling them to do that, they're not going to experience it and they're not going to learn it for themselves.
Yeah, that is such another big piece is the repair is, I mean, and you know, this is my wife with my girls. You know, we'd have a blow up or whatever, and I'd do something, whatever, and she'd be like, "You need to go apologize to them." And I was like, "You were outside your mind." My mom never. My mom.
Yep.
It was not good. It was not healthy. It was not beneficial. And then, you know, and I'm 45 now. She's gone, and she never owned the way that she treated us. And so my wife's over here saying, "You need to go apologize," and I'm like,
Yeah.
"You are crazy. I'm the adult. I'm the parent. I'm not going to apologize." You know, but then, you know, realizing you're teaching that humanity, that you're gonna mess up, and then you got to come back and fix it and you repair it. That's such an important piece that I think a lot of us adults and parents don't want. They don't want to do that. They don't want to say that, I need to change or, apologize for when I lose my mind or whatever.
Yeah. And it's the same, it's the same thing as what you were saying earlier. If you're able to kind of grasp some of those, that I don't have to have the answer for every single situation. I have to be regulated, and I have to help regulate, but I don't have to know how to do every single thing, right?
Yeah.
And there's some relief that comes with that. And it's the same way when, and at my age, I have gotten to the point now when I make mistakes, not all the time, but I can say I made a mistake and I'm sorry, right? And it's so freeing. Like, I wish I could have learned this, 40 years ago, but I couldn't. And for the same reason, if you think now what it would have been like to have an adult in your life say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, how powerful that would have been,
Mm-hmm.
how impactful that would have been. And then if you've ever had someone in authority, so a boss or a leader that has taken responsibility, it is powerful to experience that. And so for us to think that kids are going to learn just from our words, they're learning from their experiences with us, right? The actual experience of us with them.
Yeah, you got to repair those relationships. Well, Michelle, I so appreciate just your wisdom and your experience and just being willing to come on here and talk to us about try to understand a little bit more how the brain works, how it develops, and then how these experiences influence what we're doing, now. That's just it's just powerful.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it, and I'd be happy to talk again. It's just fun to talk to somebody else who has a passion for doing this kind of stuff. So
My plate's kind of full, I run this
I'm
nonprofit
sure.
and I'm a dad and everything, but I love digging into this. It helps me with my past, my history, and then it helps me hopefully to be a better parent and stuff like that. And I just want to share that, and so I've thought like maybe I should go back to school and be a counselor. I don't know. I'm 45. It might be a little late,
It's never too late. It's never too late. But I'm not so sure you're not being a counselor, even if you don't have the degree for it. So I wouldn't be too worried about that.
Yeah. Well, Michelle, it's so I really appreciate you coming on and just sharing and really for the work that you've done. I mean, 18 years at Boys Ranch, and I can't imagine the number of lives and kiddos that you've influenced through your work out there. Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you, Dr. Parker, for your sponsorship of our episode. Guys, be sure and like, subscribe, share, do all the things. We've got really important and valuable stuff that's on here, and we want more people to be able to access it and grow and learn with us. And so please like, share, subscribe, comment in the section down below what city you're listening in. And guys, have a great week. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.